Thank you all for being here. It's a marvelous opportunity for the Woodrow Wilson Center to collaborate with the Mirage Foundation on this program and on some activities. And I just hope all of you will come back to the Woodrow Wilson Center. 3 of our programs here at the center are collaborating on this. Our Comparative Urban Studies program, our Mexico Institute, and our U.S. Studies program. And thank you very much for being here. I'm going to turn the floor over to Paul Mirage of the Mirage Foundation. And I also want to say Mujgan Masumi, who's a very important member of our staff, did a lot of work on our side to put this event together, and she's not in the room right now, but I wanted to thank her for all she did. Paul, welcome to the center, and good to have you here.
Thank you very much, Mike. Once again, I want to thank the Woodrow Wilson Center for your hospitality and your help and cooperation. This would not have been possible without you. Thank you. We're going to be discussing a very important issue today, and I'm thrilled that all of you could be here to share in this discussion. Today, the issue of immigration, of course, is first and foremost in the minds of a lot of people, and fortunately some action seems to be taken on it and finally is coming to the center stage. But the question of integration is one that is ongoing and important not only today but into the future. Even if you disregard the issue of undocumented individuals in this country, with some 12 million or so, generally under the current statutes, about close to 1 million legal immigrants come into this country every year. So a child born today during his or her lifetime is going to witness the arrival of 75 to 85 million new legal immigrants to our country. And the big question is, how do they get integrated into our society so that they represent a movement into the mainstream of American life? How do they become active, solid citizens who can contribute to the economy and contribute to the cultural diversity in a way that is compatible with American traditions? This is the question that we are addressing today. And I think we have some wonderful people over here, wonderful experts that are going to discuss it. And I, for one, am very excited to hear about it and looking forward to it. I'm going to turn the microphone over to Frank Bean. Is that right? Okay, all right. Andrew?
Just wanted to welcome you all to the Woodrow Wilson Center. As many of you know, this is a place for public dialogue and for advanced research. We work on a number of issues, but immigration has been very much at the center of what we've done. We had the privilege of working with the Migration Policy Institute last year, the Manhattan Institute, on a task force on immigration, America's future. It's something that our U.S. Studies program, our Urban Studies program, our Latin American program work very closely on, and we're very honored to be able to partner with the Mirage Foundation in putting on this event today. So thank you very much for considering us. We're very honored to be part of this initiative.
Let me take it from there and help frame this afternoon a bit and then see where we might come out. I think we're going to be talking about what is the definition of integration and assimilation. Once we get that far, if we do, and there is consensus, we can talk about, in effect, is it occurring, particularly with Latino and particularly, Mexican population, because that is the general focus. And if it isn't occurring, what are the obstacles? And if it is occurring, how can we speed it in terms of if we accept that, the definition or alternative definitions? And we'll talk about the issues impeding assimilation and integration. And then lastly, I hope we wouldn't be in Washington if we didn't talk about policy options. And if we didn't make this a practical exercise in suggesting things that might really, happen and might speed up assimilation. I too want to thank the Woodrow, you guys, the Woodrow Wilson Center. Incidentally, throughout this, guys, a euphemism for men and women. So it's, and I too want to thank you all for participating as partners. The format will be informal after our speakers. The speakers have been told to be relatively brief. They will introduce themselves so that we don't have long definitions of who they are, and they will be able to tell us who they are in their talks. And we will lead off with Frank Bean, who has written a paper for us for this forum that you all have, I believe. Frank?
Thank you, Marshall. I don't know whether this comes down any further. Maybe it's unnecessary. I'm Frank Bean from the University of California, Irvine, and I'm director of the Center for Research on Immigration, Population, and Public Policy there, a mouthful. Have worked on a paper on Mexican immigrant assimilation, incorporation, integration recently with my colleague, Dr. Susan Brown, who's sitting right over here, which this is part of a larger project on Mexican immigrant incorporation, which will eventually culminate in a book on that topic. In the 3 minutes that I have left, let me try to deliver my Gettysburg Address on Mexican immigrant integration. And obviously I can't do that, but I think we would all probably agree that a tentative consensus seems to be emerging in the country that unskilled, low-skilled immigrants, particularly Mexican immigrants, are fulfilling an important workforce need in the United States. I could tell some interesting stories, and maybe we'll have an opportunity to do later, I think, that illustrate that. Given this workforce need, the effectiveness with which it will be met, and the overall well-being and health of the country in the long term depends upon whether these immigrants become successfully, obviously, integrated into the country. We've tried to take a hard look at this in a new way. The two major innovative features, I think, of our examination are that instead of just talking about assimilation in the abstract, or one dimension of assimilation, or another dimension of incorporation, we've thrown in everything that we could think of. So we have 56 different indicators. We've also tried to take a look at this across 3 generations. And it's not been very easy to do this because the data have not existed very often. The data that are collected by the current population survey through the Bureau of Labor Statistics lump the third and later generations all together, and so it gives a kind of mishmash assessment for third-generation persons. There's some other issues that one would want to discuss in talking about all that sort of thing. But we use some new data collected in the Los Angeles metropolitan area, which I think is a particularly good place to assess this for reasons that we don't have time to go into. Anyway, we find basically that Mexican immigrants are making headway. They're making headway more rapidly in the sociocultural realm. When we boil all these indicators down, we find there are 3 major dimensions that matter: economic, sociocultural, and spatial, where people live, how close they are to other opportunities, and so forth. But we find that the economic headway is occurring more slowly, the economic and the spatial to some extent, than the sociocultural. We also examined migration status of these of the parents of second-generation persons to see how it relates to this headway. And one of the things that, again, not surprisingly, but we do find some evidence of this, is that unauthorized entry of parents is associated with moving more slowly. even when people have an opportunity to legalize and naturalize. Those who do legalize and naturalize do much better. Their kids do much better. And incorporation proceeds more rapidly across generations. Those who are unable to do this proceed more slowly. And we break out some of the reasons for this. One of the important, I think, untold stories, I think it's untold. Michael and Doris can correct me if I'm wrong. In a lot of the current policy discussion is how important a role the 1986 Immigration Reform and Control Act and its legalization programs has played in paving the way for the incorporation and integration of low-skilled Mexican migrants into the U.S. workforce and into U.S. society. With that, I think I'll...
Okay, thank you, Frank. Michael Fix? Is he here yet, Brandon? Oh, there he is. Okay. I didn't see you come in.
It's because you haven't seen me for 15 years.
It was wonderful coming back to Washington. Good to see you, Michael.
It's good to see you, Marshall. And I want to thank the Mirage Foundation and the Woodrow Wilson Center. Thank you so much for inviting me today. And I want to really take this opportunity to let you know that this is a terrific paper, and I want to congratulate Susan and Frank on a really excellent paper that I think makes a big contribution, not just, I think, to the integration literature, which is enough to make a contribution to, but I think it makes a significant contribution to the current debates that we're having on immigration reform, but quite prominently, but somewhat less prominently, to the issues of immigrant integration, which are sort of under the surface of the immigration debate. I want to talk just a little bit about some complementary results that we've obtained in work that we have commissioned at MPI in our new National Center on Immigrant Integration Policy, and a recently published volume that we came out with on immigrant integration called Securing the Future, as well as a report that we've just come out with for the Carnegie Corporation of New York on English language learners. I'll start with making my comments, and I'll use up my time rather quickly. With integration writ large, then I'll talk a little bit about immigrant education and educational progress, which I think is very much at the center of Susan and Frank's paper, and then I want to make a couple comments about the current policy debate. In terms of the broadest trends, we commissioned a paper from the former chair of the sociology department at UCLA, Roger Waldinger, who many of you may know. Roger has been historically something of a skeptic about immigration, and what he did was he committed the analytic sins that Frank and Susan have avoided. What he did was he looked at generational progress nationwide, and he broke, using the CPS and using the census, and he broke the population down by sending regions: Europe, Asia, Mexico, and Latin America. Now, I only mention this paper not to call attention to our work, but because it generates results that are so closely aligned with Susan and Frank's paper. Specifically, what Roger finds is, and what this paper finds, is there is really little evidence of the emergence of what could be called a new rainbow underclass, with the kind of thing you hear discussed in the undercurrents of the current debate. What the paper also finds is that all groups, including, I think, somewhat surprisingly, Mexicans and Latin Americans, and especially Mexican women, are making substantial cross-generational progress along a host of integration dimensions, which we can come back to. They include high school completion, wage and salary income, and even job quality, that is to say whether you get a pension and whether you have health insurance coverage. Still, the paper raises two worrying concerns, which I think this paper raises, one of which this paper raises as well, which is that despite all this progress, what you see is you don't see parallel progress among Mexicans and Latin Americans when it comes to college completion, which I think Frank's and Susan's paper of the obligations of the family and the costs of post-secondary education really helped me understand. And second, the paper brings out something that I hope we can discuss today, and that is, if you look at integration, what leaps out is the lagged progress along a number of measures of integration that's being made by African Americans in the United States. Let me turn briefly to education, and for the lucky ones who thought to pick up this handout, there are graphs which sort of graph my points as I go along. Obviously not necessary that you have it. When it comes to education, I want to focus on K through 12 education, which is an area where Susan and Frank refer to as an area of an integration slowdown in some ways, I believe. And I want to note several trends which sort of suggest obstacles to integration, and I think that are captured in the handout. And I think that they demonstrate that despite these kind of long-term positive trends that Frank maps and that Roger maps, I still think policymakers need to be wary of taking too much of a laissez-faire, hands-off approach to integration and just assuming that the paths of the past will be borne out in the future. The first trend I wanted to note was that there has been an extremely rapid 60% increase in the share of the limited English proficient, in the number of limited English proficient students in U.S. schools just over the past decade. And this is occurring at a time when overall school enrollment is flat. This raises lots of competition for revenue questions. It turns out now that limited English proficient children make up 10% of U.S. enrollment in the United States. Second, there's been a striking increase in the number of kids in the U.S. with one or more undocumented parents. According to our pal Jeff Pissell, there are roughly 5 million kids with one or more undocumented parents. They represent over a quarter of all children of immigrants in the United States, and 2 million of these kids are themselves undocumented. And here what I would say is that one of the great contributions of this paper to the literature and to the policy discussion is it's beginning to quantify the persisting disadvantage of living in these families represents for these kids. A third trend, which you can see in the charts, which is also, I think, quite pointedly raised by Susan and Frank's paper, is the high levels of concentration that we find among these limited English proficient students in U.S. schools. Over half of them go to schools where a third or more of their fellow students are left. 70% of limited English proficient kids in the United States go to just 10% of U.S. schools. And what we find is that these patterns of hyper-concentration aren't just found in Los Angeles. They're not just found in New York. They're not just found in Chicago. They're found in these new growth states that are attracting immigration now. And it seems to me that this pattern of concentration reflects the kind of slowed trend to spatial integration that Frank discusses. And it points up, I think, the fact that these kids aren't just going to schools that are economically and ethnically segregated. They're going to schools that are linguistically isolated, and these are the schools that, by and large, are failing to meet standards under the No Child Left Behind Act and are being sanctioned. Finally, and I'll hold my discussion of the policy context, this segregation, I think, may partially account for a final trend that I want to mention, and that is that 3/4 of limited English proficient kids in elementary schools in the United States and over half of limited English proficient kids in secondary schools in the United States are second or third generation immigrants. And this means that they were born and presumably raised in the U.S. and educated in U.S. schools. And I'd have to say it doesn't appear that they were particularly well served by those schools. I think I've overspent my time, and I'll come back to my policy points later.
Go ahead, Doris. By the way, I should tell you that 15 years is a magical number. The last time I saw you, Doris, I facilitated a meeting with Mickey Cantor and a group on the border and pre-NAFTA, and you were one of the highlight speakers. And so it's nice to be with you again after 15 years.
Thank you. 15 years later.
15 years later.
I'm going to try to. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the policy implications and challenges that jump out of this paper for me as I read it. And I'm going to start with this question of immigrant admissions vis-a-vis immigrant integration, because most of our policy debates and heat over immigration, particularly lately, has to do with admissions policy, who we admit to the United States, and there's very little connection in the policy discussion made between that and integration. and immigrant integration. And those of us who are analysts and analytically oriented always bemoan the lack of that connection. And we call for these things to be much more closely associated in the policy discussion. We, at our own center, MPI, we've created an explicit program on this to be making these connections. Steve and I worked together on a task force last year with the Wilson Center, where a big point we made in our report was the importance of having these things be discussed in tandem. But I must say that reading this paper says to me, careful what you wish for. Because I do think that one of the red flags in this paper for a general reader is that this is research that, regardless of the reasons, says, bottom line, some of these people, the largest single nationality group, Mexicans, are not doing as well as perhaps we might want them to be doing. And that can lead to the idea, if you're putting admissions and integration together, that integratability, I have no idea if that's even a word, that integratability ought to be taken into account as part of the criteria for how you admit people into the country. And that the likelihood of speedy and effective integration ought to be a factor that is weighed. It's not so, I mean, in fact, that is really happening in our public debate. It's happening in a couple of ways right now. It's manifesting itself in this discussion of the point system, that somehow or another we should be getting the best and the brightest, regardless of what our information is about labor markets and where the range of skills we need, that the people that we ought to be picking for permanent immigration are the ones that are the most highly qualified, i.e. the most integratable. And secondly, it's manifesting itself in the flip of that, which is that the work that needs to be done when it's on the low-skill side of the spectrum should be done by people coming here only temporarily, who will not be allowed to have a chance to have any kind of a permanent stake in society. So the research is fascinating and important and needs to be explained carefully and framed carefully, it seems to me, from the standpoint of what people draw from it. Secondly, what jumps out at me is then the question of, well, all right, what do you do about that? I mean, it seems to me what you do about that possibility, that likelihood, is that you've got to do a great deal more. We, as a policy community, need to do a great deal more in understanding and having ideas for the kinds of investments that need to be made to make people be fully able to be integrated effectively. And in that connection, I'm going to say something that may be controversial, and so you can take me up on it later. But I'm fascinated. I've always been fascinated by the fact that we are in a period of large-scale immigration now. We have not had a similar period of large-scale immigration historically for 100 years. But that time that we did it at the, from the switch to the 1900s to the 2000s, we had something called an Americanization movement. Now, Americanization is a word that we are not allowed to use today. We would not use today. We won't go into a discussion of all of that. But the Americanization movement is a historic fact which I don't think any of us truly understand. And I have always wished that there would be some good analysis and good research on what that really was, because my understanding of that is that it was a major public and private, heavily private investment, heavily philanthropically based investment that led to at least 3 important outcomes that have been enduring and that really were essential in integrating new immigrants. Number 1, a strong, viable public school system. Number 2, the public library movement. And number 3, adult education as an education system. It just seems to me that given this debate today, we would be well advised to know a little bit more about some of this history. If it's not relevant, so be it, but I have this sense that it must be. The third thing that I would say is that, and if it is relevant, then the real question is, how do you get that engagement? How do you really mobilize the society for the kind of a national project that really is suggested by this kind of research, given the fact that we know how important immigration is going to be to us in the future. The final thing that I would say that comes out to me in this paper is this point that both Frank and Michael have made. It is that legal status matters. Legal status truly matters, and we just don't hear enough about that. People are not, lawmakers, policymakers are not sufficiently convinced of how it really matters. This is an issue that is really near and dear to my heart because Frank makes a big point of talking about how, the data in here on how much better people do based on naturalization is really dramatic. And that is naturalization as a priority in the government is something that I worked very hard to achieve when I was at INS, and that's a whole separate story which has all kinds of hills and valleys in the road, but I really believe that naturalization is something that should be much more aggressively promoted as a national policy, not simply left there as something that people can or cannot choose to do. And I don't mean coercion, I mean facilitation of naturalization. So the issue with naturalization in this data brings it to a whole level beyond the way we typically have talked about naturalization, which has been that it allows you to bring your relatives to the country. It's the way the immigration system works most effectively. It's important for participation, political engagement, etc. But this research has real economic and success factors across the spectrum associated with naturalization. So that you have the potential here of an incredibly more robust win-win for both the individual and the society at large. There really is a national interest point here that's made, I think, in reading this naturalization information. But what it leads to bring it back to the current debate, it seems to me, is that the first step on that road is legalization. And it makes me think about the calculus that is being made by some of our political leaders at this point on whether or not there will be a bill that will come out of the Senate for all of the things that are, I think all of us would have to agree, imperfect about that legislation. It may well be that the people who are really the far-seers, to the extent that they exist, are making the calculus, if nothing else, get legalization. So, thank you.
Thank you, Doris. Senator?
Everybody please relax. It's just the politician talking. I'll hold forth for just a couple of minutes and save your questions for the people who really know things like Doris. It was a trial for me as an escapee from William and Mary with the BBA a long time ago to work my way through this paper. But a couple of things strike me that are a little different than others. It doesn't surprise me that normative behavior leads to greater success. So I think that's I was glad to see that conclusion reinforced for me in my mind. But as I look through and looked at the indicators that led to success in integration, one thing that I thought is important for you to consider as you think about policy alternatives is the fact that almost all of these mechanics and mechanisms and institutions are not grounded in Washington, D.C., and they're not federalized programs. They're actually programs of local government and the states. And as we look to influence or to help people think through solutions that are more innovative than what we've seen for the last 15 years as we have kind of muddled through the issues of immigration, I think it's important to take note that the language acquisition is clearly a critical issue, and it's about 60% funded at the state and local level, not at the federal level. K-12 education in the United States is 95% funded by state and local governments, controlled almost exclusively by local governments across the country. Higher education is predominantly funded by state government, where there is public education. State scholarship assistance dwarfs the Pell program by about 5 to 1, I think is the numbers that I recall. So the mechanics that we look at that really give people a chance to make progress based on the study, those mechanical things are in many ways distributed through the 50 states. And so if we're going to be successful, we have to talk in terms that states and state legislatures and state governors and local people will understand. This is not a solution integration, I don't think, that we can have a command and control attitude about. And if there's a weakness in what I see as a state legislator in the policy development that takes place in D.C., is it takes place in a bubble that's almost impenetrable to people out in the field who actually have the responsibility to implement. We only have to look at the federal government's fiasco in trying to issue passports for travel to the Caribbean to think about the federal government marshaling the resources to do this. You know, somehow MasterCard and Visa issue, I don't know, 750 or 800 million charge cards every single year, keep track of who has them and who owes and who doesn't owe and who pays. And we seem to have a problem managing about 85 million passports. So, you know, we need to be more innovative. I think some of the barriers that new immigrants face that are going to continue to challenge us is our institutions don't necessarily model current development of how people see things. You know, it's very interesting. I had never heard of the Americanization movement, and it's one of the things I would be interested in learning a little bit more about. And questioning whether institutional higher education as practiced in the United States today, which in my opinion is built very much on the Oxford-Cambridge model kind of through the Princeton reforms and then the GI Bill, is appropriate for the emerging population and the way we develop and learn today. Whether the internet and distance learning and a lot of other things don't call on all of us to be responsible to kind of rethink the basic institutions that absorb most of the resources that we can apply to these problems and you kind of question those fundamentally. As you know, you only have to contrast the success of federal welfare reform with what I think is kind of the very limited success of No Child Left Behind to understand that a command and control policy like No Child Left Behind, written by well-intended people on the Hill, has been controversially and not very successful or very quick. Where welfare reform, where we encourage states and state governments and local people to innovate in trying to find solutions, was much more successful. So as we look at integration strategies, I would just urge you to think more in a distributive model as you come up with policy alternatives. Challenge the institutions. I mean, I think that someone earlier made the point that maybe we really ought to question whether our K-12 system is organized today, which absorbs more resources than any other country on earth. By student, I think we're number 2 in the world in spending. Only Finland or Sweden spends more GNP per pupil in K-12. So it's not a resource problem. Some people might argue it's a system that's organized very well for the adults that work in it, provides good work conditions and good benefits, but maybe not what we really want for our children. And as we look at, you know, the fundamental keys that give new immigrants an opportunity, providing kind of the policy enlightenment and innovation and driving that down to state legislatures and to local governments where the rubber really meets the road is probably the most compassionate thing we can do as we try to think through strategies of how to help people immigrate successfully and integrate successfully in the United States.
Frank, I think before we go to the general audience, why don't you take a minute and respond? I mean, you've heard, I think you came through relatively unscathed with a little comment on the, you know, difficulty of reading for a non-academic, but I think we will...
Furniture salesman, that's as good as I could do.
But I think, your paper highlighted some important issues, suggested some policy alternatives, and made us aware of the importance of legalizing the immigration process. Do you have any comments to the comments that were made?
I don't think so, really, Marshall. We're a little bit behind schedule. I'm not sure I followed what Doris meant about needing to be careful in how it's framed. I think maybe what she was referring to is some people might read this paper as indicating lack of assimilability or integratability of those mangled words. Is that what you were referring to, Doris?
Yeah, no, I mean, you know, these kinds of things can always be misused.
And that's something that's worth thinking about. I mean, I didn't see it that way, but maybe somebody else would see it that way. On the sociocultural side of things, all the various indicators from family to religion to ethnic identity to linguistic things and so forth, the change across generations was dramatic and rapid, especially linguistically. In other words, people second and third and later generations were almost universally English speakers. Not a new finding, but one that is now once again reaffirmed, updated, and I think very important. I do think that the headway that the members of the Mexican origin population have made economically is, in my own view, considerable, considering the handicaps they face and the very low point from which they start. And I think that's misinterpreted many times, and what is oftentimes seen as dropout, high school dropout problem is in many instances a continuation of a labor migration culture and ethic that involves immigrant children and the children of immigrants continuing to work, again for many of the very same reasons that we talk about in the paper, because of unauthorized status and low pay and the need to support a lot of family members, both in Mexico and the United States, who don't enjoy access to certain aspects of the safety net to the extent that more advantaged immigrants and others do. This just slows things down. But despite that, there still does seem to be a headway that's occurring.
Before we can open it up to others, I don't know, Michael, you had some policy recommendations you didn't get to. Did you want to say something about that?
I would just mention, I would just call your attention, since when we're talking about undocumented immigrant children, to a kind of under-examined set of provisions in the proposed Senate bill, which is a significant liberalization of what they call the DREAM Act, which would extend legal status to what we expect about what we have estimated to be would be 1 million undocumented children currently in the school systems who would benefit from that. That's sort of what's in the bill that I would call your attention to, which responds very much to this point that keeps coming up, that there's these persisting lagged effects of growing up in an undocumented family or being undocumented, which bears on the children, which really hasn't been much of it, which hasn't been very forward in the debates. What is not in the discussion, and which has not been an issue which has not been particularly prominent in the debates over the bills on the Hill, and it was suggested by Steve Rauschenberg, not suggested by him, but it responds to some of his concerns that these are state and local issues, is there really is comparatively little in these bills about state and local aid and state and local impact assistance. If you go back to 1986, there was a $4 billion state legalization impact assistance grant program that was built into the bills. It's pretty skeletal right now, and one area that's striking and that we think is an opportunity would be to provide some sort of state and local aid to schools. Schools are the single largest expenditure, and it is where the political tensions are the highest. We also think that there's a lot of room here. If these bills go through as they're currently written, they will require that legalizing, adjusting immigrants essentially pass the naturalization test as a condition of legal status, of retaining their legal status. That's going to put incredible demands on a fairly weak, disorganized system. We assume, by our estimates, there are almost, the size of the unauthorized population that is limited English proficient is something on the order of 6 to 7 million. So, anyway, there's precious little in these bills which bows to these phenomena.
Query. Frank and both Mike and Frank had indicated that the socio-cultural, economic, the spatial, I assume they're preconditions. Are they all preconditions equally? I mean, the country has done a miserable job, I think, of integrating Afro-Americans spatially. Now we have the 12 million undocumented immigrants hopefully getting pathways, and we have 1 million, as Paul mentioned, a year or more coming in. And if we're talking about, Mexican Americans, we did 10 out college students as testers about 10 years ago in Colorado, and found out that Mexican Americans are discriminated against as much as Afro-Americans. Now, it may have changed since then. And in the mortgage market, the same way. So, again, if these are all preconditions, and the spatial one is as important as the social, cultural, and economic one, we need some more policy thinking.
Which may get, if I can ask a follow-up to that, it may get a couple things that are different about earlier waves of immigration. One is the fact the economy has shifted in some ways. To some extent, a growing economy in the post-war era was very useful in absorbing earlier waves of immigrants, but also that there's an ethnic, racial stratification in a very stratified, ethnically and racially stratified country. To some extent, there may be some different dimensions. So, yeah, what does that do to analysis?
My colleague Susan Brown may want to comment on this because this is kind of her area of specialization. By spatial, if that's not clear, that's an academic jargony term to some extent for those of you who may not be familiar with this language. It has to do with where people live and how that reflects the headway they've made in economic progress in this country, or the lack of that, and whether where people live, in what kind of communities, exacerbates the effects of other things, which is a big point that scholars working on black-white spatial segregation have made, that black spatial separation substantially aggravates and exacerbates the inability to find good jobs and other kinds of things. And one of the things that came out of our analysis that we wasn't sure would come out was that the spatial dimension has its own separate impact, which is not inconsistent with the idea that it exacerbates these other things. But it says it's not merely a reflection of these other things. It has its own effects. In the Mexican and the Hispanic case, one of the things that complicates the picture is that over the last 10 or 15 years, there have been so many new immigrants that, and they do tend to live when they first get here, where other immigrants live, that it's hard to separate out empirically what the tendency is for this spatial segregation to be diminishing, because it can be diminishing among those who've been here for a while, and among the second generation, and among the third generation, even as it's increasing among the newcomers, and then when it's measured overall, it looks like no headway is occurring. Marshall raises a point that I think is the critical issue in understanding the dynamics of what's going on with Mexican immigrants, and he was suggesting in some studies, I guess, that had been done in Colorado, there appeared to be evidence that just as much discrimination occurred against Mexican immigrants as against African Americans. That doesn't accord with my own reading of the evidence, or at least with what I think is the case in some other studies, but this is an issue I think that there's not a consensus on. It might be one that we would want to discuss somewhat, but a lot of policy implications turn on, I think, the answer to that question. Susan, did you want to comment?
Susan?
Yeah, the reading that I have made of the literature is that despite the tremendous amount of discrimination that Mexican Americans have faced, no group has faced discrimination the way that the African Americans have, that it's just far and away worse than any other group. And they're the group that has been ghettoized far more than any other group. It's the group that's been ghettoized far more than any other group. And as a result, the segregation of blacks and African Americans continues and persists at a much higher level, and that the Mexican Americans are slowly, perhaps, it may take a couple of generations. Usually what we're noticing in LA is that it's the third generation that is really moving into areas that are more Anglo than before. That up until the third generation, they're in neighborhoods that are pretty heavily Mexican. And then by the third generation, it's starting to switch and they're moving out. But it's taking a few generations. But it's happening. Whereas that is not necessarily happening at the same extent among the African American population. So that there really is a very distinct difference between looking at segregation levels for African Americans and for Mexican Americans.
All right, Susan, are they going into, as you know, blacks who have made that move are going into older suburban communities, and the whites or the Anglos are moving out to the exurbs? Are the Mexican Americans, according to your data in LA, moving into the older suburbs, or are they jumping into the more growing, more affluent suburbs?
They're jumping. They're moving in, especially in the LA area, they're moving into what's known as the Inland Empire, Riverside and San Bernardino counties, which are growing tremendously fast and where housing is popping up, but it's also more reasonably priced housing.
Okay, it's time to go to anyone here. All of you are experts, all of you are equal. And let's see a show of hands for anyone to raise any issues or questions. We have a lot of people, so let's try to be relatively brief. Yes, sir. Tell us your name and your affiliation.
Al Milliken, affiliated with Washington Independent Writers. When you speak of legalization, how do you use that in coordination with amnesty? How are you going to sell the idea? How do you propose using and dealing with amnesty?
Who are you addressing this to?
Yeah.
Well, I raised the issue. I must say that I've been toying with this for a while, and it really hit me again reading this paper today. This whole debate is, we know the amnesty is the A word, it's the big, dividing line issue, etc. And the people that are that use words like legalization, and the president himself are constantly saying that whichever new proposal is on the table is not an amnesty because you have to pay a fine, because you have to wait a long time, because there will be backlog clearance and those people that did it, or try to play by the rules will come first. None of that matters to people that are against an amnesty. This is an issue of religion. Almost in terms of the anti-amnesty feeling runs so deeply. It is a variety of things. We can speculate on all the things that it is. My sense of it is that we ought to just say, yes, it's an amnesty. We must have an amnesty in this immigration reform. We must have an amnesty because these people are here, they're contributing all the things that we hear, and because if they have legal status, and then you morph into the evidence that is here. In other words, we have not heard and we do not talk, we are all defensive about the issue of why a legalization is important. Because we're all trying to guard against the problem that somehow or another these people were lawbreakers and they shouldn't be rewarded for having broken the law, et cetera, et cetera. My sense of it is that, and it's not going to happen this year, but that as this debate goes forward, if it isn't settled this time around, that there are a lot of things that are going to have to be reframed. And one of the reframings, it seems to me, that we've got to take very seriously is how do you reframe this amnesty issue? Because if this bill fails, a great deal of it will be over the amnesty issue. And my sense is stipulate it and then explain why it is so much in our interests to do it. And a lot of the evidence for that is here.
Comment on that question. Let's try to keep on point until we have, not exhausted an issue, but if there is counterpoint on the amnesty issue, let's hear it. Frank, do you have Mike? Or
well, just one quick divergence on that. From my perspective, and I'm not as well position to look at it nationally. A lot of the amnesty is a reaction to what people see in the states and in the localities back home as serial malfeasance or serial mismanagement of the border. The issue of amnesty is the concept of rewarding illegal behavior and encouraging it to occur again. There is almost no faith in any place that I have been in Illinois. I ran statewide in 2 elections there unsuccessfully, but I got to travel the state. There's almost no confidence that the federal government has a handle, a concept, or the will to secure the borders. So, I mean, underlying the amnesty thing is not so much, I want a pound of flesh out of the 11 million people or the 12.5 or whatever the number is that are here. It's that we want an end to a border that rewards people for breaking the rules and denies entrance to people who comply to them. And that, with all due respect to Senators Kennedy and Senators McCain, neither one of them have tried to sell that as a central point of what they're doing. And there's not a lot of confidence in those two, or Bush, for that matter, as guys who really get it. So, until you kind of deal with that, 70% of the country or more is very concerned about rewarding illegal immigration with what's perceived as an amnesty. So, I would have told you 2 years ago that amnesty was a problem but not a big one, but I think the problem's exacerbated. We ought to be very realistic as we look at policy alternatives, and that, if you can't with confidence look people in the eye and say, we understand how to stop. I mean, the promise of the Reagan amnesty was that it was the last one, and the promise of the amnesty under Clinton, or the fast naturalization under ICRA, was those were supposedly solutions, and so that's what's eroded at the base level with a lot of constituencies, is that they don't think this is the end; they think it's the beginning.
Any comments from the panelists on amnesty as?
Well,
Get rid of the jargon and just say flat out it's amnesty?
I think there needs to be a little bit more nuance in the discussion. I agree with Doris there. I mean, you can focus very narrowly on the fact that somebody crossed the border illegally, and I, as I read the evidence, it's only about a quarter of the population that very intensely focuses and fixates on that single issue, but I may be wrong about that. The other side of the coin is that these people are laboring away, most of them, very hard at low pay, many for a long period of time, under very severe conditions, doing jobs that are difficult and so on and so forth, and dangerous, and maybe giving them a chance to integrate into the society and become better society members. Is just compensation for that part of the equation. The little anecdote, the demographic change in this country, which has gone unrecognized by large swaths of the population. We're having fewer children and have been for a long time. That raises the average age of the population. We are living longer. We're getting more education. We're more affluent. All of these things that increase the need for low-level service workers and increase the demand. I tell my little Iowa story. In the state of Iowa, during the 1990s, Iowa has the second oldest age structure of all states in the United States. More people left Iowa in the 90s than moved into Iowa. That's been true, I think, for 2 or 3 decades. Audrey may know exactly on that score. Say, well, let's look at foreign-born, native-born. Well, certainly more native-born left Iowa than went to Iowa. Iowa has a great educational system, but it's mostly an agricultural state. People leave and go to Washington and New York and Los Angeles and other major metro areas to find jobs after they finish college. So what about the foreign-born? Well, more foreign-born left Iowa than moved into Iowa. And if we break it down by legal status, well, what about those who were legal? Well, more people who were legal left Iowa than moved into Iowa. Well, what about the illegals, the unauthorized? More of those moved into Iowa than moved out. Are they dumb? I mean, do they just go in there because there's a place to pitch a tent? No, there's work to be done, and that needs to be done there. Does it cause some difficulties here and there? You know, does it put some strains on the school system sometimes when they show up in slightly greater numbers than the school projections? Yeah, it does. There are things that need to be dealt with there. But these labor needs are growing, and I think the awareness of this is growing. And I don't see that screaming about amnesty is going to cope with that. So yeah, we'll call it whatever it is, but we need these workers.
Yes, ma'am. Tell us who you are.
Hi, Megan Yumini. Thank you so much for being here. I actually have a question for Mr. Michael Fix. You brought up the DREAM Act, and Doris brought up the issue of amnesty. And I'd like to know, where does the DREAM Act stand in relation to amnesty? And if we were to explain the significance of the DREAM Act, how do we do so? Do we couch it? Do we explain it in terms of amnesty?
The DREAM Act, for those of you who don't know, offers the potential for legal status to those who have been in the United States for 5 years or more, who graduate from high school, who then proceed on a track to post-secondary education in community colleges or four-year colleges, or who join the military. It seems to me that the logic, first of all, this is what's striking about the DREAM Act from a public policy point of view is we've had very few public policies in the United States which are as prescriptive as the DREAM Act. I mean, to really dictate that you have to go to college or you have to join the military in order to get a benefit is a very, dictatorial kind of edict that comes out of the federal government for a population that has, historically had a very high dropout rate, and for whom those may not be the two best career options and the ones that promote the highest level of integration. I mean, there's lots of other options that might be on the table. The idea here how this is not an amnesty, of course, follows the same logic as the old Plyler versus Doe case, which I would say may be in jeopardy if we don't fix illegal immigration. And that's that these kids came here as innocents. It was not their choice to come to the United States, and they have earned these equities in terms of being successful in the United States. And we want their counterparts to graduate from high school and not to become, if you will, a new underclass. So they have, if you will, to some extent, greater equities than their parents in the argument. However you might view that.
Other questions or comments? I have a question of the panel. If the senator would come back. Oh, he's just getting coffee. Okay. You talked, Frank and Mike, and you, Doris, and the senator about the social, cultural, economic, spatial as sort of instruments to a integration into society, but they're instruments. You haven't talked about what that integration really then means for the society. I mean, it assumedly means that they're matched, similar in their opportunity to native-born Americans. But it's sort of vague. I mean, what does integration, fully integrated, mean? And the second part of that, have there been any recent studies on community reception to the undocumented, for example, in Iowa or North Carolina? And has that, what is the community role in this integration process? It's a big one. And in effect, we've come in on one side of the equation, the integration of immigrants to America. And what is then the community's response, and how are we going to accommodate that?
I think Michael's comment about a possible aid for schools here, even though the schools are adequately funded in the United States as measured by these international yardsticks, but in Steve's comment about state, a lot of these costs being borne at the state and local government level, this reminds me of a conversation I believe I had with Steve a year and a half ago, now that I think about it. And I think some of the concern, a great deal of it at the state and local government level, occurs when unexpected enrollments occur in schools that disrupt the academic programs of the schools. I watched this happen in the case of my own son in Austin, Texas. And the school district there had very sophisticated demographic projections. Despite that, an extra 150 students showed up in the high school, and they were almost all children of unauthorized Mexican immigrants. It was Austin High School. Now, that doesn't sound like a lot, but having to find, you break that up into that's 6 or 7 homerooms of 20-some 5 students each, having to find the extra teachers after the school year has already begun, having to find the classrooms, it throws everything into turmoil. And if you've ever been the parent of a child who's been trying to get their own solve their own adolescent high school problems and learn something, and it just freaks parents out. And it has nothing to do with rejecting immigrants or not appreciating the work they're doing in the community or being ethnically prejudiced or what have you. It just that nobody wants to see their kid not get, lose a whole year because nobody planned for this or nobody funded it. Now, maybe it's a lot. I'm sure it's a lot more complicated than that in many instances, but I think that there's a lot of it, and so the reception in that sense is not terribly welcoming, but that's something that's fixable. And I think the kind of thing Michael was talking about is potentially a part of the fix. Mr. Fix?
Well, part of what aggravates the schooling issue is exactly what Steve Rauschenberg mentioned, which is that you have high levels of immigration. You have immigration colliding with new mandates from the No Child Left Behind Act, and you have the fact that under the No Child Left Behind Act, schools are being held accountable for the first time ever for how well limited English proficient and other immigrant subgroups do. They are actually, they're broken out, and if they fail to make substantial annual yearly progress, the school fails. And if the school fails, there's lots of downside there, right down to the school being to the faculty being fired and the principal being replaced, and that sort of sets it. That has two effects, right? First of all, this is a population that has not historically gotten much attention within schools. We've documented that, and second of all, and that has changed. I mean, schools are paying more attention to English language learners, and they're paying, but we don't know yet whether their achievement levels are going up as a result of that. But it creates this whole level of tension that we haven't seen in the past. I would also just say that in terms of the community level, one of the stories of the last 10 years in terms of immigration and integration policy has been, in effect, the devolution of both immigration policy and integration policy, starting with welfare reform, which gave local communities and gave states powers to make decisions about the rights of immigrants, which they hadn't historically had. And so what you have is you've set up, and then that, to some extent, there's a path from that to what you see is this proliferation of local ordinances and regulations around immigrants, a kind of a local politics which just was not on the map 10 years ago, really wasn't on the map 15 years ago. These were federal issues. The bottom line is immigrants are encountering widely different climates of reception place to place, and then the integration question is there. To what extent does that have a long-term effect on their integration? And Frank and Susan's writing would suggest that it has an important impact on their integration.
Yes, ma'am. Tell us who you are.
Thank you. Philippa Strum from the Wilson Center. Thank you all so much. I mean, that's a great way to get us thinking about all of this. I would like to ask Steve a question, and maybe this bounces off something that Michael was just talking about, the whole education spectrum. Because, Steve, you said that perhaps for the sake of these immigrants, we need to rethink our higher education system. And as somebody whose former workplace was the City University of New York, where generations of immigrants were integrated in every way that you can think of, economically, culturally, spatially, as a result of that education, why do you think the current immigrants might need something
So yeah, I apologize in advance for all offense I give to people who believe in the current higher education system. I just think there's a question today in the way adults learn and the flattening of the globe and the fact that continuing education, continuing job readiness and development are critical. Putting most of our resources into the Carnegie unit model based on a 185-day school year and a 2-semester or 3-quarter model that predominantly we spend probably 75% of our money on 4-year institutions, place-bound 4-year institutions, might not be the best allocation of resources. And maybe emerging from this data, the people who really need our help don't fit this traditional Anglo-Saxon 18th century English model that we adapted for the 4% elite of America prior to the GI Bill. You know, I guess I would argue as a state public policy maker and funder of higher education that higher education does, at least in my committee work, a poor job explaining why their institutions need to operate precisely as they do and why they resist innovation. I mean, the two most consistent resistors of innovation in America have got to be K-12 and higher education. There's a lot of people who have investments in the institutions as they stand, and the more we question how institutions work, I mean, it's institutional medicine that spends most of your GNP in medicine. It's institutional education that controls the dollars. If you're not getting the results, it's not simply an argument, I think, of more resources. It's got to be, are we applying the resources correctly? Does this learning model work for 35-year-olds who are immigrating in the middle of their life with language challenges? I mean, I don't know. I just point out that part of the discussion can't just simply be resource-based, because that plays into the whole concept of winners and losers and amnesty and anger. I think it's part of our challenge is to ask our institutions, maybe K-12, maybe we shouldn't have almost the shortest school year in the Western world today. Maybe we could ask more than 5.5 hours of pretty well-paid public school teachers. Now, granted, 25 years ago, public school teacher pay was not as competitive as it is in many places today. So I guess I'm just challenging the institutions to think outside the box. If your solutions just track along more resources for the existing infrastructure, there may be barriers, and I would argue there are barriers, to the way the higher education system is used by adults in the United States as it exists today.
Yes, Susan?
I wanted to respond to what Mr. Rauschenberg had to say, in part because of some research that was done after the 1970s and 1980s. In the mid-1970s, African Americans who had graduated from high school went to college at almost the same rate as whites. And that peaked around 1975 and started going steadily down afterwards. And a lot of people said, why? And the best research to come out said it was because the federal government had changed the system for paying for higher education away from Pell Grants and more toward loans. And poor populations were less likely to get loans or to take them out. And I would argue that for relatively poor immigrants, the loan structure could be a big problem, that they have to take on huge debt in order to get through college and in order to pay for it afterwards. And this is not just an immigrant problem.
I'll agree with you. The only thing I'd stipulate is you have to add affordability to grants, because it's not just the fact that maybe the federal government Pell Grants haven't kept up with inflation. College tuitions are rising at 2.5 times the rate of GNP growth in the United States and have for the last 15 years. So it's a combination of institutional use of resources that affects affordability as well as government grants. But I'll stipulate you're absolutely right.
Yes, tell us who you are.
Hi, I'm Rebecca Adams. I'm a student and I'm also interning for Senator Kennedy this summer. And I just wanted to talk as a student and in college, as college tuitions are now up in the $40,000 range. And I think that in order for immigrants to integrate properly, then they're going to be going on their third generation and second generation into these institutions. And I completely agree with the fact that loans are a big problem. And so I think that it's the institutions' problem or the government's to figure out a different way to be able to afford colleges, but in the same sense, the middle class students who will really be hit because they can kind of afford college, but at the same time would like to be able to get some kind of loans. And so I think the more money that would be given to the lower class or the immigrants that they're trying to integrate more regularly will also be hitting the middle class. And I wanted to see what you thought about that. Anyone?
She raises that, rubbing elbows with the middle class. I mean, if you want an immigration program for higher ed and it's going to be a grant or loan program or mixed, she raises, well, how can you do that equity-wise or politically when you have a growing number of middle-class students, lower middle-class students, who can't afford to go to college?
Competition for resources competition for resources is at the heart of some of the frustration that you hear out there that's couched under this amnesty argument. It's a very real thing. I think you point out a really good problem, a real problem, and that's why, just like medicine, you're not going to. I don't believe you're going to solve our American problems with medicine by dumping another 25% of the GNP on top of an already white-hot medical system that's spending money more quickly than it needs to. I think we have to really think through whether the Cambridge-Oxford model, the campus of scholars, works for the whole population. That's not to say there isn't a place for a University of Chicago and a Harvard and a Stanford or a Woodrow Wilson Institute. But it does question whether we have a university in Illinois called Chicago State University, a state school. I think the enrollment's about 9 or 10,000, and I think the average entering ACT is a 17. Now, I would argue that school and those kids need a different educational model than the Carnegie unit that everybody else uses and the same accreditation models. We've got an inflexibility in the educational model that drives cost structures. We reward in many places teachers for not teaching. I think spend way too much money on research in many cases that's not very meaningful. Versus encouraging our best teachers in the classroom. So I think rethinking the higher ed spending is a critical part of affordability. If our goal is really truly to get 50, 60, 70% of America's youth and adults access to higher education, it's not going to be through the model that we have today, and that the sooner we recognize that, the quicker we innovate, the further ahead of the curve we're going to be.
Can I come in? Steve, I would really strongly disagree with you on that. And I don't think that it's an Oxford-Cambridge model that's being promulgated. I think one of the things that has made this country strong and which the GI Bill took advantage of were the land-grant schools. And if you look at engineering instruction, most of the engineers in the country don't come out of the Oxford-Cambridge models. They don't come out of the handful of elite Ivy schools. They come out of these land-grant places, University of Illinois, Purdue, et cetera, Louisiana State. Why is France trying to move in a direction to adopt the higher education system that the United States has? Why is China bringing the University of California a chancellor to China over and over again in order to expand their higher education system following the model of the U.S.? Why are they trying, why is China turning out 600,000 engineers a year? They say, well, they're not learning as much as the engineers in the United States. Okay, discounted by 90%. They're still turning out as many engineers as we are. Now, I think, I think your underlying implicit message that higher education is squandering money, that we don't need research and development, that we don't need to foster this kind of creative learning model and the development of innovation is incorrect.
Point, counterpoint?
Well, just that I don't disagree with many of your points. I wouldn't argue that universally we don't want collections of scholars in four-year place-bound universities, but for Chicago State University to argue for the same resource and the same structure as University of Illinois is not very, I think, good for their students. And I'm just saying that, you can't argue that everybody wants to copy our system and then point out how much more successful China and other places are in educating engineers. The American schools are not the top tier, as they might have been 20 years ago. And I just think we need to challenge our institutions to adapt to the changing model. But I'm not saying that there's not a lot of good about American education, whether I'm talking about K-12 or or colleges, and I wouldn't argue that they squander, but certainly people operating those institutions have to wonder why they can't look at productivity in higher education and why they should be concerned about tolerating rate of inflation in their cost structure that's 2.5 times the growth of the GNP. I mean, no other enterprise except government enterprise and education, gets away with those kind of things because they're forced to compete.
Michael?
I just would like to bring this back a little bit to the immigrants, and just to say that one of the things, just as an aside, which is that as I look at American institutions and integrating institutions, the miracle of integration right now is really being taken on. The heavy lifting is really being taken on by the community colleges in the United States, and I feel like they are really very market-driven, innovative institutions. I think they could do more in a lot of these areas, but they are not on the 4-year Cambridge model, and they are really where these kids are going.
Angelo, tell us who you are, Angelo.
I'm Angelo Paparelli. I'm on the Board of Trustees of the American Immigration Law Foundation, although I do not speak on behalf of that association or that organization today. I wanted to follow up on this issue of amnesty from a slightly different perspective, and it's ironic to me that we have tax amnesties and there's nary a stir from the public about tax amnesties, and the absence of punitive measures apparently not satisfying the large number of people who look at amnesty so negatively. We have punitive measures in the proposals that are part of the Senate bill to deny people the Social Security contributions they made. Today there are amendments that would deny the earned income tax credit, not only for the past but also for the future. And it seems to me we also have very high user fees, petition application fees, to promote immigration benefits. A small provision of the Senate bill would put the lion's share of the cost of this new employment eligibility verification system on the backs of the applicants and the petitioners for immigration benefits, even though 7 million American employers will use it. So what is the impact on integration when we are placing so many financial burdens, in addition to the penalty fee, on the backs of this population of the undocumented?
Frank?
I think it's enormous. I mean, I don't see any way that we can expect persons to legalize the burdens required for legalization under the bill as it's written now. Are extensive. The financial costs, the other kinds of costs. I think it risks the development of a more marginal pool of low-skilled labor. I think it encourages people. They just won't be able to afford it. They just won't be able to meet the requirements. The conditions that cause them to come here, both in their origin countries, particularly in Mexico, and in the demographic and economic structure of the United States, will continue to persist, and it will open up possibilities for more exploitation and slow down integration considerably. I think your points are excellent ones and absolutely correct. Why the whole system has to be put on a pay-as-you-go, fee-based sort of basis is an interesting question, I think.
Particularly since a lot of the benefits of immigration are really long-term. I mean, so obviously there's some upfront costs with recasting the system, but the benefits demographically, labor force, really argue for kind of a long-term financing model rather than. I couldn't agree more. I think the more restrictive and the more punitive, the more fee-oriented it is, the less likely we are to get the kind of compliance that a lot of people would hope for. Regardless of what side they are on the issue of amnesty, people, I think, want, I hope that people like Doris end up in charge, that we really have a policy going forward that recognizes labor force needs and what America needs, and that we end illegal immigration not just with 12-foot high fences, but with enlightened policy about bringing the right people to the United States in ways that they can integrate. So,
There's a petition circulating for you to get back on the job.
Oh,
Doris.
stop.
Good.
I just want to make one additional comment on this one, because I don't think that anybody in the Congress that is putting together these provisions is doing it from this vantage point at all. It's political. It is coming completely from the vantage point of, look how much we're punishing these people, therefore this is not an amnesty. I mean, we're so stuck on that this is not an amnesty by the people who are trying to promote it. I mean, I think Steve made a very good point that, the public is, first of all, very skeptical that there will be any serious enforcement, very skeptical, and they surely shouldn't be skeptical about serious enforcement at the border, because, that's just continuing to be a repository of huge amounts of money. But it is unclear what's going to happen with employers, and it is uncertain because we all know that it affects just the employer part of this is so vast and sweeping in its implications and in the changes that would have to take place. And I think the public is cynical. But again, I really do think it comes back to this idea that we're trying to prove a negative. We're piling on, trying to prove a negative, that this is not an amnesty. And we will never prove that. I mean, the people that are supporting it.
At the risk of getting in trouble with the moderator, I just would point out, I wish that John McCain was using his political courage to talk a lot about how many immigrants we really need in the United States. So that people had a frame of reference when you talk about 8 or 9 or 10 million undocumented people. I mean, when you take a look at some of the projections that I was fortunate enough to be on the task force that MPI had, I mean, the labor force needs of America are real. And as soon as we get the public much more comfortable with the size of what immigration should be in a nation of almost 300 million, it's easier to get your arms around 12. 12 in the absence of any kind of frame of reference is frightening. It's like enough to take over Illinois, like anybody would want it. So, I do think, a big part of this is getting the right dialogue, because when Congress does no amnesty and $1,100 fines and 15-year waiting periods and those kind of things, the believability with the public is so, trust level with Congress is even smaller than the president's today. And not surprisingly, I don't think it's ever been better than 50% in any survey I've ever seen.
Unless you
Yeah. Alan Crowd. I teach history at Thank you. Alan Crowd. I teach history at American University. Alan Crowd. I teach history at American University. I was very struck by Doris's comment about Americanization in the earlier 20th century, because what's so striking is how uneven it was and how slow it was. It often took 2-3 generations within a family to have the kind of integration that we're talking about, and also the role that the armed services played, both in World War I and World War II, in integrating people into the society. Moreover, there's another issue here, too, I think, that we're ignoring, and that is a cultural issue. The people who spearheaded the Americanization movement in the early 20th century cared very little about cultural diversity. They were concerned about wiping out the notion that TR had of the hyphenated American. Hyphenated Americans were bad for the country. Sensitivity to the needs of different cultural groups was not always a high priority. Certainly the Americanization program run by the Ford Motor Company, by Henry Ford and others, didn't specialize in cultural sensitivity. Today we have a great notion of cultural sensitivity. And so whatever we do in terms of our programs that we cast in order to foster integration, we need to have a greater sensitivity to cultural diversity than perhaps the folks who were doing this in the early 20th century thought that they needed to have. Moreover, part of the unevenness was the enormous difference in things like educational systems across the country. Without any kind of federal financing and so on, there were some states like New York that had the City College and Hunter College and free higher education institutions, but other parts of the country that had nothing like that. And so there was that, lent itself to the unevenness that we're talking about. So we're talking about two very, very different worlds. And I think a world in the early 20th century when citizenship meant a good deal less than it does now, simply because there were no benefits to be had from citizenship. There were, how many federal entitlement programs can you name before 1930? None, really, that would have helped the immigrants. And so consequently, folks were here and could live their entire lives as legal immigrants, but registering every year, not pursuing citizenship, and yet making a contribution to the society. So we have to be careful in the analogies and wonder how much of what we see in the early 20th century is really applicable to the environment that we're dealing with today.
Alan, convert your comment, on the cultural sensitivity, to a policy recommendation.
I think the policy recommendation is that we not attempt to duplicate many of the Americanization programs of the early 20th century because they were not culturally sensitive. Because, in fact, they often used coercion, as in the case of the Henry Ford Americanization program, to punish those who would not conform. And I don't think we want to foster policies that would do that in this era. I think we want to avoid that kind of coercion. We want to persuade people to embrace the country. We want to encourage people to embrace the country, but we don't want to be coercive and punishing for those who do it at a slower pace. And that raises the question: is how fast do we really expect to accomplish integration? We speak as if thinking about the discussion we've had, that it might be accomplishable in a generation. But there was no such expectation in the early 20th century.
Doris, you were the one that made the infrastructure comment that we had one.
Well, this is very interesting because what I would say in response to that is, of course, I think that the Americanization idea and movement has been pretty soundly discredited. But it did happen during the last and therefore most recent period of mass immigration or large-scale immigration, which we are now re-experiencing and haven't experienced as a country for 100 years. And I'm wondering whether, in listening to you, it seems to me that I would certainly agree with you on the cultural diversity point, but the deeper points that you were talking about seem to me to be very relevant. Number one, it doesn't happen in a generation, whatever the it is. This is a long process. It is a cross-generational process. That's really an important thing because one looks back at history and everybody has their gauzy stories about their grandfather and, great-grandfather, and we all think that's just wonderful and terrific. And somehow or another it worked wonderfully then, but it isn't going to work now. That is the basic general, kind of narrative that's going on right now. Well, if in fact it was a multi-generational process, that's instructive. Secondly, whatever Henry Ford did or didn't do, Henry Ford was a private actor. He was a major employer. Is this, and it goes to your point about what are the, that you raised earlier that we didn't really talk about, what's the community role and responsibility in this? Employers obviously were involved. We know private philanthropy was heavily involved. We know extraordinary institutions like Hunter College and in New York came out of it, and maybe it was uneven, but why was it uneven? And were those kinds of institutions that came out of it, in fact, things for which there are analogies? In other words, the lessons learned issues of what we did as a society, plus or minus, and who were the actors, and what were the things that we ought to be learning from when we were in this kind of a period before, just seem to me to be fascinating, and they're not part of our debate.
Yes, sir. Tell us your name.
Ben Johnson with the American Immigration Law Foundation. And I think, I want to, the subject of amnesty has come up, but I think that the subject of this particular conversation is much more at the heart of people's concern about immigration than amnesty itself. I think amnesty is mostly people not wanting to talk about what their real fears are and focusing more on the illegality that they're confronted with now. Lou Dobbs is an easy example. He talks about his ire is reserved for those who have broken the laws, but he likes the legal immigrants. But then in listening to his show, he's against chain migration. He's against H-1B visas. So in reality, I think what people are fundamentally uncomfortable with is the future flow issue. And if you look at what Senator Kyle has done in negotiating this legalization proposal, what he's done is he's given a little on the legalization end, but taken a lot in terms of demanding that there be lower, or at least the same level of immigration moving forward, and that none of the temporary immigrants coming tomorrow will ever have an opportunity to stay permanently in this structure. So I think future flows really is at the heart of this debate, and it comes from, I think, a discomfort that are today's immigrants different than the immigrants that we romanticize in the Ellis Island period? Is it going to be slower to integrate these? Is it going to be more expensive to integrate and incorporate these people in our communities? The speed with which the Heritage Report talking about the costs of undocumented immigration is circulated in the media, I think, is evidence that people are worried about the costs and the speed of the integration. And I think the Americanization movement, you're right that most people were uncomfortable with the lack of respect for diverse cultures that existed then, but they seem to like very much the results, right? So, and I think what's happening now is people aren't so comfortable that our newfound respect for diverse cultures is going to result in the implementation of programs that will get that same kind of result, a sense of us, of togetherness, of integration, and I wonder, though, so I guess my question is it knowable? Is there a way to know or to talk about whether today's immigrants are different than those that we romanticized about before? Is there much sense of whether the integration that's needed and necessary of the immigrants that will be arriving in future flows is going to be hugely expensive in ways that might put people's public benefits at risks? And how do we accomplish, in fairly untested waters, integration where we have a newfound respect for cultural identity that we didn't have before?
Good questions. Frank?
I think those are wonderful issues and wonderful questions, and start to get to the heart of some of the concerns. It seems to me the heart of some of these concerns is a little bit different from your emphasis. Ben? Is it there? Yeah. And I think it has to do with the security of the population overall. Their economic security, and their job. They're worried about their future job. They're worried about their future pensions. They're worried about their health care, and the constant reminders that appear and emerge every day that these things need to be cut and taken away in order to achieve economic competitiveness and corporate viability and increased shareholder value and so on and so forth. We could rephrase all those in multiple ways. And there's been quite a bit written on this. There is an enormous emphasis on insecurity, and there's actually hard evidence supporting it that people can expect to hold more jobs during a lifetime than they used to hold, and so on and so forth. And there are losers in this process, even though overall it may be the society overall may benefit, particularly the very low skilled and particularly people who get caught in life course binds. People who lose their job because of some restructuring when they're in their 50s. Training programs and all these other kinds of things don't really help very much. It seems to me that context is extremely important, and what can you lash out against, or what can you try to change, and then those of us who want to emphasize demographic change and point to what I think are the very real workforce needs of the nation at both the high end and the low end. We're not just making this kind of thing up, but it's once again the same kind of dilemma that emerges in the public schools. A lot of attention paid to the high end, a lot of attention paid to the low end, and everything in the middle gets ignored, and it doesn't make for much positive receptivity to notions of change and to concerns for putting these unskilled immigrants who've come and labored away here, putting them on a pathway to legalization when nothing's being done about the real concerns of all the rest of the population.
Yes, sir. Tell us your name. Mishkan, it's not working.
Okay. Here you go. Oh, thank you. I'm Robert Gonzalez. I'm a Mirage Fellow, and I'm a law student. I was wondering, I think there's a set of forces that we haven't discussed that impede integration, and those are generally what you would call globalization, but more specifically the rise of transnational communities and the importance of remittances, lower cost of communication across borders. So these things that are fundamentally different than the last wave of immigrants from Europe, and they are definitely, I think, slowing the integration process, but they're not necessarily harmful to our immigrants, especially the Mexican immigrants. And also bilingualism, some retention of bilingualism, which I think is at a higher rate than the European immigrants. So I'm just wondering, how do we deal with these impediments to integration, which aren't necessarily bad?
Anyone want to take that on? The changing context within which the immigration argument is the world is flat. Yeah.
Flesh out Mr. Gonzalez's point. Susan Brown has a forthcoming paper in a journal called City and Community that estimates, in the effect of remittances in the case of the Mexican origin population. It is non-trivial. I mean, it's about 25% of. It slows down moving into Anglo neighborhoods by the third generation by about 25%, is one way to put it. So, I mean, it is a real phenomenon. Is that a bad thing? I don't know that it's a bad thing. I mean, it's just a real thing. I mean, because the parents of, somebody comes as an unauthorized migrant, they work in a job that doesn't provide much of a pension, or even if they pay into the Social Security system, which many of these Mexican immigrants do, they're not in a position to themselves draw on Social Security, so their children, who do substantially better, then spend a lot of their money, and we're getting more and more documentation of this in our research. We're focusing a lot on it, both qualitatively and quantitatively. And then the money gets spent taking care of these parents. Sometimes the parents go back to Mexico, and the money goes back to Mexico in the form of remittances. Other times it's here in the U.S. In either case, it's slow. You can't buy as big a house or send somebody to college when you're spending money taking care of parents, because the parents labored away for 25 years in a job that didn't provide access to the kinds of safety net factors that other parts of the population have access to.
Ben, as you were talking, you sounded like Alan Greenspan a bit in the social side. Several of you have there's a polarization here. Forget left and right, because it's not split left and right. But those who are in favor and arguing for high-end, low-end, need for skilled and unskilled workers have a certain rational exuberance. I mean, they quote numbers and they quote. And those who are arguing for less immigration have a certain opportunity costing. I mean, in effect, what are the alternatives? Who is going to be hurt? The equity issues and efficiency issues. Let me ask a tough question. How much of the fear that Americans have on the amnesty issue and Mexican Americans as a different culture is a race issue? How much of it is racism still in the country? Now, your colleague, Frank, at our last forum from San Diego, Wayne, indicated that he thought a big portion of the impediments to intergenerational progress was still the race issue. And so, again, I throw that out, and I'm sorry for comparing you to Alan Greenspan, but it's a good comparison. Yes?
My name is Onyeofa. I'm a Mirage Fellow 2005, and I thank you for bringing up the race issue because I think it touches on the point system. I wanted you to talk a bit more about this issue that's arisen, where we would favor people who have who are highly skilled workers and prefer them for immigration. And I can't help but think about my Nigerian background and the fact that there was an article published recently in the New York Times that talks about how African universities, which used to be produce some of the most wonderful scholars, are just in a state of disarray and decay. And I just think of my relatives and other individuals and talented people that I know who are back home and are not getting the education that they need to have those those high skills to be favored for immigration to the United States. So that's one thing that I think about. And also with this point system, I think about if you are favored to come to the United States and you are a highly skilled laborer, but you are faced with parents who are back in Mexico who are undocumented, and as you said, Mrs. Brown and Mr. Bean pointed out, when your parents are undocumented, there's not a benefit. You are at a large disadvantage. So I just want us to discuss these issues and how the point system relates to them.
Mike?
I would call your, and Doris can elaborate on this. We've just done an analysis of the impact of the point system as it's currently kind of configured in the bill, which is covered in the, and there's an article in today's New York Times by Robert Pear that cites it. And what it shows is a couple of things. First of all, that it's strikingly that if you look at past patterns of immigration to the United States, it seems that Africans will not be disadvantaged under the point system because so many have come in with high educations and high skills and English language skills. The same holds for many of the sending countries in Asia, but of course in Latin America and Mexico, these are countries that are going to be, which would disproportionately lose out under a point system. So it's hard. So from a race analysis point of view, it doesn't necessarily lead to a return to the old quota system that we had in place before the 60s.
Any other comments of any panelists on the race issue, the point system, their integration? Are they one and the same, or is there a race issue, and how severe is it?
Well, you asked the question first before the comment came about race in this, particularly with regard to amnesty, et cetera. I think, race and xenophobia are factors. But I think in the same way that we learned with, or should have learned, out of the Proposition 187 era 10, 15 years ago, to just consign it to race and xenophobia is not only to misunderstand it, but to not succeed in overcoming it. Because surely that's there. It's always going to, I believe it probably always will be part of, human nature as we know it, at least from what we know today. But there are many other issues that are bound up with the immigration issue that go to the things that have been talked about here. I mean, overall economic insecurity, questions about whether the government is serious about really carrying out its obligations under the immigration law, real pressures that are felt at in any micro situation in a particular school, in a particular hospital, in a particular community, and those are fair game, and we have not paid attention to them as a country the way we should. So we have to take that very seriously. We can't just say those people are all racists.
Can I just add one
yes,
point?
go ahead, Mike.
I just have to say on this race issue, it's going to depend a lot by community. We've just come back from holding a roundtable on schools in Tennessee, Georgia, South Carolina, and North Carolina. And in these new destination communities, the immigrant population is almost uniformly Mexican and largely undocumented, and the two become highly conflated in terms of political resistance and political acceptance within those communities. So, and that context is really quite different from the context in New York City, I would say.
Yes. Tell us who you are. I'm going to try to break and summarize around 10 past 4. Some of us have, in fact, all of you, Paul has sent me a note that all of you are invited tonight to celebrate immigrants who have made a difference in this country and immigrants who will make a difference in this country, our fellows and our 4 national awardees. And so if you are not coming, you're welcome to come. Let us know. It's at the Press Club at 6:30.
Patricia Mazzei, I'm another Mirage Fellow, and I just spent the past 4 years in Miami, where the immigration debate is a little bit different. It usually revolves around the Cuban Adjustment Act, and which, if a Cuban enters the U.S. legally and stays here for a year and a day, they can apply for a green card. And so none of these Cubans would have to go on a point system. A lot of them came without speaking English, without having any of the skills that the point system would reward, but their kids, second or third generation, are graduating college and getting scholarships and becoming doctors and lawyers and everything like that. And I was wondering if there's any kind of way to reconcile that, if there's any research that, because that's an amnesty and nobody really discusses it because it's an ideological amnesty, I guess. And in Miami, the big issue is between that and the Haitian immigrants that don't get that amnesty. And I don't know if there's any research on that. You could tell us numbers, maybe from the Cuban community, that would support extending that to other people.
Am I correct in this? It seems to me like this again brings together 2 issues. One is the fact that these people are given legal status, but the second is many of them are received as refugees and asylees, right?
Yes. Yes.
So this is a population that is the beneficiary of our only formal federal integration program in the United States. In other words, they get benefits when they receive, they get health benefits, they get
but they come in illegally.
They get some management. They also go into they go into a community in which a successful immigrant community as well. But the combination of legal status, settlement program, as well as a warm, if you will, climate of reception, promotes integration. And one of the things we're seeing among refugees is, over the last 10 years, is there's rapidly declining poverty among refugees and rapidly declining use of public benefits among refugees.
Her question is also, and if I take it correctly, is an equity question. I mean, how do you justify the Cuban refugee status quickly? But I mean, that's a policy issue and is justified by politicians because of Florida, I suspect.
Yeah, I mean, they underscore the fact that maybe what we need here is a more proactive integration program.
Right. If that has worked, there and it's been successful, wouldn't it be successful for other groups of immigrants? Wow.
Yeah, just to reinforce what Michael says, I mean, one response to that would be to say, well, we've got to not allow that kind of thing to happen. It's not fair, and at one level it's not. On the other hand, if you look more, not only at the Cuban case, the Cubans have gotten exceptionally generous treatment, as indicated by that program and other programs. But look at refugees more broadly. As Michael says, they're the only ones that we sort of welcome with open arms. They're the only ones we give some help to. And we give different amounts of help to those who come from different places. And track them over time, over 10, 20 years, they're the ones, controlling for all these other factors, or trying to control for all these other factors that intervene in the process. They're the ones who seem to be doing the best. So does it follow from that we don't give anybody any help? Are we so afraid that somebody's going to get something for nothing? I mean, I think that's what a lot of this amnesty thing is about. It is so much of our fixation and obsession in times of insecurity and times of rising uncertainty about the future. People are very hesitant for somebody else to seem to be getting something for nothing. And so let's take it all away. And so, now that people have pensions are being accused of being in an unfairly advantaged position. Is the answer to take away their pension? Or is it to have a broader pension system? Which way are we a better society?
Yes, sir. Tell us your name.
My name is Aaron Terrazas, and I have two questions. Hopefully there's enough expertise in the panel to answer them both. First of all, much of the discussion here has focused on the need for a long-term, permanent focus in immigration policy toward path for naturalization, et cetera, in the Senate bill. This really differs from the discussions that were held at a conference about 2 weeks ago at the World Bank, which underlined the need for circular migration as far as temporary entries and exits, returns, etc. So I guess if the Senate bill tries to pursue both of these goals, is it then not deemed to fail? And the second question goes more to the questions about integration, etc. I don't think a question that hasn't been raised is integrate to what. No one's mentioned that this American identity is really dynamic over time. It's not static. So perhaps the panel could address that as well.
David, do you want to respond to him? No, okay, then let me wait until I get a response from our guest panel, and I better.
I mean, I wasn't at that. Did you say World Bank meeting? So I don't know where the circular migration idea came from. But there's an idea that's been promulgated that were it not for the increased border enforcement in the U.S.-Mexico border, we would have more circular migration of the old kind that we used to have, temporary labor migration from Mexico. I think that's a myth and a fiction, just to be explicit about it, because I think there are lots of economic changes and social changes that have taken place in Mexico that I could go on and on about, that have increased the permanence of migration from Mexico to the U.S. And they have to do with the lack of viability in the small town, economic viability in the small and rural towns in Mexico. Circular migration makes sense when there's something to go back to. As that diminishes, it makes less and less sense. There are also reasons why permanent migration or longer-term migration has increased in the United States. Again, having to do with wide variety of social and economic changes in the country. The idea that somehow that we can return romantically to the past of circular labor migration, I'm perhaps unfairly characterizing it and stylized a little bit, but I just don't think it's realistic. So that's my opinion on the other one. I think you're entirely right about the integrate to what, particularly on the sociocultural dimension. The United States is much more socioculturally dynamic, fluid. I wouldn't call it fragmented, just diverse, heterogeneous. And so there's no single thing to integrate to. In some ways, the integration is to a world of difference and a world of diversity. But the key aspect, I mean, everybody agrees, though, that we don't want an impoverished, underclass, immigrant, low-skilled workforce with no chance, and a group that thinks it has no chance for upward mobility for any of a variety of reasons. We don't want the situation of the Moroccans and the Banyus of Paris. So in that sense, I think we have a clear notion of what we mean by integration.
David Herson?
Herson, a partner of Fragment, Del Rey, Bernson and Lowy, and we only do immigration law. Just a different perspective, having been an immigrant 28 years ago and come into this country. We've been talking all about the illegal level and the lower level of person coming in. But there's another group that most people don't really notice, those people who come from certain countries and then group together and almost click. And it's interesting to see that. So I just put that out for people to think about, that there are different levels of non-integration, and usually those groups I've found, and from my personal experience with people from South Africa, that the first generation coming in will stick together, but then the children will most times become educated and move out of the lager, so to speak. Thank you.
You know, two comments on that, David. I was on the advisory board to Rouse at Columbia's inception, before Columbia, and Herb Gans was on, and he was very profound, and Antonia Shays and others in 63, 64. And one of the issues in our first board meeting was, at what level do you integrate Columbia? Do you integrate it at the neighborhood level, or do you integrate it at the community level? And the choice made by these generally left of center liberal types, but scholars and practitioners, were that you couldn't do it at the neighborhood level easily, and that the community level integration, if Rouse did that, he would be succeeding in building a model in, Columbia. And if that's true, and I think Frank, again, whether it's older suburbs, newer suburbs, Henry Cisneros, which was on our board, prompted a question about what infrastructure does the community need to integrate if it's spatially concentrated? And he pointed to the Jewish experience and having an infrastructure internal to the community, and there are lots of reasons, and it's not, I think, similar to the Mexican experience, and entirely, or maybe not at all. But in effect, he was asking, how do you build infrastructure for integration within the Mexican community when they come here, first generation or second generation? And that gets to the senator's sort of not debunking, but questioning or asking that we rethink current institutions, higher education, and K through 12, and maybe the future block grants to states and local governments, giving them maximum freedom, could also try to look hard at community institutions within the Mexican community that would aid and abet integration of the Mexican or expanded choices. And so maybe the first generation, second generation can be, collapsed a bit. But those members of the panel and you all in the audience asked, well, how quick do we want it? And I think the only answer is relatively quicker. I mean, the more it happens, the better it is, and we'll know it when we see it. But anyhow,
let me just touch on that, because as we look at the demographics and the growth model that the United States is, this is not just a phenomena of dealing with this current bulge. It's about becoming a more immigrant-friendly society. So, I thank you for remaking my point much more eloquently and less abrasively than I did. That our institutions have to reflect what it is we want to be. It's not simply enough to say we're pretty satisfied as baby boom generation people with the way the institutions worked for us, and the assimilation problem is theirs, not ours.
Yes, Andrew, you've been very patient, and go ahead.
Oh, no, I just actually wanted to ask the panelists, talking about the circularity question, it seems to me that we're going through possibly a seismic shift in terms of immigration policy. Maybe Doris is something you want to comment on, or Michael. That we're beginning to talk about guest worker programs. That's something we've never done in this country, and we've kind of moved into this idea that we don't want immigrants to come here and stay. What we want is people to come and leave. I mean, is this a seismic shift, or am I missing something here? I mean, is this really kind of a dramatic change in how we do immigration and how we think about integration?
Well, I mean, we've always had temporary immigration programs, and we have all kinds of visa categories that allow for temporary immigration programs at all skill levels. And I would say, in response to the question about circular migration vis-a-vis what's being talked about today, that although I agree with Frank that the circular migration idea is not really been borne out in experience, and the factors don't argue in favor of it in the way that it's been characterized where the border is concerned. However, from a policy standpoint, good policy is looking for both circular migration and by that I don't mean from a policy standpoint, you certainly want incentives in your immigration structure for people to return to where they came from, whether they be foreign students or whether they be, agricultural workers. But you also have to recognize the reality that a lot of it will, in fact, be permanent immigration, and you don't want, the critical point is that you don't want to close off without any possibility of moving to permanence huge categories of people in the way that's being talked about in this debate. I mean, after all, 200,000 a year or 400,000 a year cumulatively over 2, 3, 4, 5 years is more than 1 million people. And those people not able to in any way become permanent is a terrible integration recipe. And it is even more terrible based on the fact that a large number of those people will stay not only because they don't have something to go back to, but because the jobs that they are in are ongoing, permanent needs in the labor market where those employers will want those people that they've trained, and there are not going to be sufficient incentives for them to return. So that is a seismic shift. It does take us back to a Bracero kind of an outlook, and to a thing that other countries have tried that doesn't, in my opinion, bode well for the overall, social good integration issue.
Time for one last comment, then I know there are hands up, but we're going to continue this debate. But I want, Michael, you had a response, and Frank, try to keep it brief, and then we'll move on.
Well, I've just seen a seismic shift in my own mind on this.
Okay.
On the one hand, it has always seemed to me that temporary immigration and the notion of cyclical migration, the cyclical migration was a dubious concept, and the temporary migration was a terrible idea. It was simply a way to avoid paying the cost of integration and to avoid having any kind of to owing any debt and paying any price to the immigrants in our midst. But it seems to me, as you think hard about it, a lot of immigrants are here for temporary reasons. They have every reason, they have every intent on going home. And it seems to me like the public policy structure should promote and enable those decisions instead of impede those decisions. And to the extent that policies impede those choices, they're probably misguided.
So some sort of circular migration, but some possibility. Right.
It's a both and, not an either or.
Marshall, yes, Frank, go ahead.
I do think there's been a shift of sorts, and in my view, a very good statement and capturing of this is in a book by an immigration lawyer, Hiroshi Matamura, who talks about citizenship, but it's the difference between welcoming immigrants and expecting immigrants. The case 100, 150 years ago, the model was immigrants were going to become a part of the new society, and were treated as if, from both a policy point of view, I mean, of course there were strains, of course there were tensions, of course it took generations for them to learn different new languages, and et cetera, et cetera. But it was citizenship as training and waiting, not citizenship as you have to prove yourself, either your loyalty, or citizenship as you get a free ride in the way of social benefits. And this is the idea of citizenship that he's trying to promulgate in this book. And I do think there has been something of a shift in American culture and policy orientation in this regard. And it does get, the idea is immigrants are something to come and do here and do what we need doing and then leave, but they belong somewhere else. And that's always going to be a mix of both temporary and permanent things. But I think if we can have this attitude that immigrants are an integral part of America, not something that just is here for our temporary benefit, that we would be better served.
Okay, let me try briefly to summarize, and it's hard to summarize a conversation like this, but first of all, Frank started off by saying there's been progress in what he calls assimilation or integration. And it's been slow and sometimes begrudging, but there has been progress. He indicates that, instrumentally at least, that progress to continue will probably have to be in the economic area, in the social cultural area, and spatial area, recognizing the problems with each, which then become a public policy argument. He suggests that, and all of us, I think, here seem to agree, that legalization through naturalization, ultimately, green card status is an important part to, in effect, integration. And a part of that, and complementing that, is the need to rethink the educational systems at both K through 12 and higher education, and needing to think through the infrastructure available to states and local governments and communities in terms of a welcoming environment, a supportive environment. I think, overall, I think the panelists and the audience generally agreed with that. We had some not disagreements, but we fine-tuned the definition of generational, how soon, how quick, and what are we integrating to. And there was this increasing recognition that America is itself constantly becoming. And that answer about what are immigrants integrating to will hopefully always change, but it's trying to allow them the choices and the opportunities that the major part of our population, has. I think if I had to take a poll today on the Senate bill, it probably would get majority support, however begrudgingly. I think there's a recognition that some of the provisions in it are penurious and will impede the integration that we all seem to want to occur. On the other hand, it's a first step, and if it doesn't pass, we may be set back for a long time. So, but there was an overwhelming excitement, but I bet tonight we'll look at the Washington Post reports and see if the Senate voted on it. Because it's an important milestone that needs, if it passes, will need constant improvement and attention. I, for one, want to thank you all from the Mirage Foundation. I want to turn to Paul and let him and Andrew end the day. Thank our panelists. You've been a wonderful audience. I used to do the Aspen Forum as a facilitator. You're better. And thank you very much, Paul.
I would also like to thank all of our panelists and, once again, the Woodrow Wilson Center. Obviously, this has been a very wonderful and informative session. I have learned a lot myself. I hope you have. This is, as we expected, is not a simple issue, very complex, and is tinged with rational as well as emotional aspects. It's probably no simple answers out there, and it's going to be at some point the result of the policy will be a result of some compromises that hopefully will be kind of sane and not in either to either extreme. Having said all of that, I think integration still remains a very, very